Hello and welcome to Marple's Mind, where every story feels like a conversation. Over a warm cup of coffee today, I bring you a brand new Miss Marple mystery, filled with twists, clues, and clever deductions. Make yourself comfortable and let's unravel the case together. And if you'd like, leave a quick comment and tell me where you're joining from. It's always a pleasure to know where our little detective community is tuning in. From now, let's get started. Chapter 1. The Letter in the Snow. The village of St. Mary Mead lay hushed beneath a thin, reluctant blanket of snow, the kind that falls in hesitant flakes, as though the sky itself were uncertain whether winter had truly arrived. It was the 3rd day of December, 1952, and the war still felt close enough that people spoke of ration books more often than of Christmas. Jane Marple sat alone in the small drawing-room of Dame Mead, her knitting needles moving with their usual quiet precision. A coal fire crackled in the grate. On the table beside her lay an unopened copy of the Times and a half-finished letter to her nephew Raymond. The clock on the mantelpiece had just chimed 3 when the doorbell gave its familiar apologetic jangle. Mrs. Knight, the Daily Help, appeared with a silver salver, on which rested a single envelope. "Postman says it came by the afternoon collection, Miss Marple. Thick envelope, too. Looks important." Miss Marple laid down her needles and took the letter. The paper was heavy cream-laid, the kind that had almost vanished during the war and only now crept back into use among those who could afford it. Her name and address were written in a hand she had not seen for 40 years, yet recognized at once. Tall, elegant, slightly backward-sloping, the writing of a girl who had once ruled the upper fifth, with charm and a hint of steel. Lady Eleanor Winter, Frostmir Hall, near Wintercombe, Yorkshire. Inside was a second envelope, sealed with crimson wax impressed by the winter crest, a stag beneath a crown of icicles. Miss Marple broke the seal carefully. "My dearest Jane, if you still permit me the familiarity of your Christian name after all these years, I beg you to forgive both the abruptness and the melodrama of what I'm about to write. I am in danger. 3 husbands have died within 7 years of marrying me, each death ruled misadventure or accident by coroners who preferred comfortable verdicts to uncomfortable truths. The newspapers, with their fondness for alliteration, have christened me the Winter Widow. I do not altogether blame them. The coincidence is striking. Now anonymous letters reach me, always in the same hand, always containing the same warning. The 4th husband will die on Christmas Eve. I have no 4th husband, Jane, not yet, but I intend to remedy that before the month is out, and I find the thought terrifies me more than I can say. Frostmir Hall will be full of guests for Christmas. Old friends, relations, 1 or 2 people who have reason to wish me ill. The house stands 6 miles from the nearest village. The moorland roads are already treacherous, and the wireless forecasts the worst winter in 50 years. Come to me, Jane. You always saw what the rest of us pretended not to notice. If anyone can tell whether I invite a murderer beneath my roof, or whether I have lived with one all along, it is you. A car will meet the 11:47 from King's Cross at Wintercombe Junction on the 18th. If you cannot come, burn this letter and forget I ever wrote it. If you can, bring the little green valise you carried when we went to Switzerland in 1910. I still remember how sensibly you packed. Yours, in hope and dread, Eleanor Miss Marple read the letter twice, then folded it with care and placed it inside the pocket of her grey cardigan, close to her heart. She sat very still for a long minute, watching the snow slide past the window in soft, purposeless spirals. Mrs. Knight returned with the tea tray. Everything all right, Miss Marple? You look ever so thoughtful." Miss Marple's mild blue eyes rested on the housekeeper with the gentle detachment that so often caused people to underestimate her. "An old school friend has invited me to Yorkshire for Christmas, Mrs. Knight. Lady Winter. Perhaps you have seen the name in the papers." Mrs. Knight gave a disapproving sniff. "That one with the husbands? I shouldn't like to spend Christmas in a house where people keep dying, if you'll pardon me saying so." "Death is no respecter of seasons, Mrs. Knight," Miss Marple replied tranquilly. "And one should never refuse an appeal from an old friend. I shall go." She rose and moved to the little walnut bureau where she kept her writing paper. The note she penned to her nephew was characteristically brief. "My dear Raymond, I am called away rather suddenly to Yorkshire. Please do not worry. I shall be staying with Lady Winter at Frostmir Hall and expect to be home early in the new year, weather permitting. Your affectionate aunt, Jane." That evening, while the village slept beneath the deepening snow, Miss Marple climbed the narrow stairs to the attic. There, beneath a pile of old theatre programmes and a box of dried rose petals, she found the small green valise, somewhat battered now, its leather cracked at the corners but still serviceable. She carried it downstairs, dusted it with a lavender-scented cloth, and laid it open on the spare-room bed. Into it she packed 2 warm wool dresses, her thickest cardigan, 3 pairs of Lysol stockings, a hot water bottle, a tin of barley sugar, her Bible, a notebook with a pencil tucked into the spine, and, after a moment's consideration, the small mother-of-pearl revolver that had once belonged to her brother and which she had never in her life fired. At the very bottom she placed the crimson-sealed letter. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft and silent and merciless, erasing footprints almost before they were made. In the quiet house, only the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall broke the stillness. Miss Marple stood at the window a long time, watching the white world beyond the pane, her reflection faint and ghostly in the glass. "Poor Eleanor," she murmured at last, 3 husbands dead, and now she fears a 4th who does not even exist, or does he?" She turned away, drew the curtains against the night, and went to bed. But she did not sleep. Longines, into the small hours her light burned, and those who passed along the lane, though none did that night, might have seen the silhouette of a little old lady sitting upright against her pillows, eyes wide open, thinking thoughts that were not gentle at all. 15 days remained until Christmas Eve. Chapter 2. Arrival at Frostmir Hall. The train north was almost empty. A commercial traveller snored in one corner, a young wren clutched a parcel on her lap and stared out at the white fields. And Miss Marple, wrapped in her old squirrel coat, sat quietly watching England slide past under a low iron sky. At Wintercombe Junction, the platform was a chaos of steam and drifting snow. A porter shouted that the connection to Frostmir village had been cancelled. The roads were already impassable beyond High Fell. Miss Marple stepped down onto the icy boards with the calm of a woman who had expected exactly this. A tall man in a dark green Loden coat detached himself from the shadows of the waiting room. "Miss Marple, Lady Winter's car." His voice was clipped, military, with the faintest trace of Yorkshire beneath the polish. "Graves, secretary." He took her small valise as though it weighed nothing, and led her across the yard to a black Daimler, whose engine was running, the exhaust blooming white in the freezing air. A uniformed chauffeur touched his cap and opened the rear door. They drove for 40 minutes in silence, the big car ploughing through drifts that grew deeper with every mile. Hedges became white tunnels. Stone walls disappeared entirely. At last, the headlights picked out tall gateposts topped with stone stags, their antlers crusted with ice. The drive beyond was unploughed, but twin furrows showed that another vehicle had passed earlier that day. Frostmir Hall rose suddenly out of the darkness like a great ship frozen in mid-voyage. 3 stories of blackened stone, rows of tall windows glowing amber against the night, a dozen chimneys pouring smoke into the racing snow. A single lamp burned over the porte-cochere. Graves helped her out. The wind struck like a blade. "Her ladyship is expecting you," he said, and for the first time Miss Marple noticed how carefully expressionless his face was, as though all feeling had been trained out of it long ago. Inside, the entrance hall was a cavern of oak and crimson carpet. A vast fire roared beneath a mantel carved with the same icicled stag. From somewhere above came the muffled sound of a woman laughing, bright and artificial. A footman took her coat. Graves was already halfway up the great staircase. Lady Winter asked that you be shown straight to her sitting room. The other guests are at tea. Miss Marple followed, noting everything with her small, unhurried glances. The threadbare patches on the Persian runners, the faint smell of damp that no amount of log fires could quite disguise, the way Graves's shoulders never relaxed. At the top of the stairs, a door stood ajar, spilling warm lamplight and the scent of jasmine. A voice called, low and amused, "Is that you at last, Jane? Come in before I die of suspense." Lady Eleanor Winter had not changed so very much. The famous silver-gilt hair was now fashionably short. The violet eyes still held their old power to startle. But the bones of the face were sharper, the skin almost translucent. She wore black velvet and diamonds at her throat, and she rose from a chaise longue with the fluid grace Miss Marple remembered from hockey fields 45 years ago. "Jane." Eleanor took both her hands and studied her with something between affection and calculation. "You are exactly the same. It is infuriating." "You, on the other hand," Miss Marple replied mildly, "have become even more beautiful. Danger evidently suits you." Eleanor gave a short laugh and rang a little bell. "Tea, or would you prefer sherry after that journey? You look half frozen. Tea, please, and perhaps you might introduce me to your household before the snow seals us in completely." "Of course. Everyone is longing to meet the famous Miss Marple." Eleanor's smile did not quite reach her eyes. "Though I did rather hint that you are simply my oldest friend come for a quiet Christmas." A maid brought in a tray. While the cups were filled, Eleanor talked lightly of the weather, the difficulty of getting decent servants since the war, the outrageous price of coal. Only when the maid had gone did she lower her voice. "They all know about the letters, Jane. Servants talk, and the village shop still stocks the more lurid Sunday papers. I have told them you are here because I am nervous, nothing more dramatic. I would rather not have them watching one another like cats just yet." Miss Marple sipped her tea. "And who exactly is here?" Eleanor counted on her fingers, the diamonds flashing. "My stepdaughter Clarissa. She is 23 and furious that her father left everything to me. My cousin Rupert Winter, who believes the estate should have come to him and drinks rather a lot of my whisky to console himself. Colonel Blimp, Reginald Blimp, retired Bengal Lancers, who claims he was once engaged to me before the Great War and has never quite forgiven me for jilting him. Vivian Vale, the actress, you will know the name. She is resting between pictures and says the country air is good for her nerves. Mr. Graves you have met, and Hargreaves, the butler, who has been here since Noah. She paused. 7 guests, 8 if we count you. 9 souls in the house once the servants are included. The village is 6 miles away, and the telephone wires are already down. We are, as the newspapers like to say, cut off from the world. Miss Marple set her cup carefully in its saucer. And the anonymous letters. Eleanor opened a lacquered box on the table beside her and took out 3 sheets of ordinary cheap notepaper. The message on each was printed in blunt, capital letters. The 4th husband will die on Christmas Eve. No signature, Eleanor said. Posted in Leeds, Hull, and once in York. Different postmarks, same hand. I have kept them from the police so far. One does not care to be laughed at. Miss Marple examined the sheets through the thin spectacles she sometimes remembered to wear. Block capitals are useful, she murmured. They tell one so little, and occasionally a great deal. Have any of your guests shown particular interest in them? Clarissa thinks it is a joke in the worst possible taste. Rupert pretends to. Colonel Blimp blusters that he will shoot the fellow if he shows his face. Vivian wants to hold a seance. Only Graves treats the matter seriously. From the corridor came the sound of footsteps and a burst of young male laughter. Eleanor rose. Come, let me present you before the gong goes for dinner. And Jane? She laid a hand on Miss Marple's arm, the diamonds cold against the wool sleeve. Thank you for coming. I have the strangest feeling that time is running out rather quickly. Miss Marple patted the hand gently. My dear, time always runs out quickly at Christmas. That is half its charm. She followed her hostess out into the lighted corridor, where portraits of long-dead winters looked down, with the frozen expressions of people who had never expected to be murdered in their beds. Somewhere below, a clock struck 6. Outside, the wind rose to a howl, and the snow beat against the tall windows like a living thing trying to get in. Chapter 3. The First Dinner and the Curse. The gong sounded at 8, a deep bronze note that rolled through the house like a warning. Miss Marple descended the great staircase slowly, one gloved hand on the icy banister. She had changed into her best dove-grey silk, old but immaculate, and pinned at her throat the small amethyst brooch her mother had worn to Queen Victoria's Diamond Jubilee. The drawing-room doors stood open. Firelight and candlelight flickered over oak panelling and the faded crimson of the curtains. A Christmas tree, far too large for the room, glittered in one corner, its branches heavy with antique glass ornaments that trembled whenever anyone passed. The company had already gathered. Lady Eleanor, magnificent in black lace over cloth of silver, stood by the fireplace with a man Miss Marple judged to be in his late 40s, square-shouldered, sunburnt, with a moustache like a regimental banner. Colonel Reginald Blimp, unmistakably. Near the window, a girl in emerald velvet smoked a cigarette in a foot-long holder and stared out at the whirling snow with open dislike. Clarissa Winter, the stepdaughter. A younger man, dark, handsome in a rather obvious way, glass already in hand, leaned against the grand piano and watched Clarissa with lazy amusement. Rupert Winter. The actress Vivian Vale had arranged herself on a chaise longue in a gown of midnight blue that left very little to the imagination. Diamonds winked at her ears and throat. She was laughing at something the secretary, Graves, had just said, though his own face remained perfectly blank. The butler Hargreaves moved among them with champagne. He was tall, thin, and utterly silent. Only his eyes moved, recording everything. Eleanor crossed the room the moment Miss Marple appeared. "Everyone, this is my oldest friend, Miss Jane Marple. Jane, You must let me present you properly." Introductions were made with varying degrees of warmth. Colonel Blimp clicked his heels and gave a small bow that belonged to the Edwardian era. "Delighted, ma'am. Knew your brother in 14. Good man." Clarissa turned from the window long enough to offer a cool "How do you do?" and a glance that priced Miss Marple's dress, and dismissed it in the same second. Rupert raised his glass. "Another old school chum. Eleanor does collect them. Welcome to the mausoleum, Miss Marple." Vivian Vale extended a languid hand glittering with rings. "My dear, you look exactly like someone who knows where all the bodies are buried. Do sit by me and tell me everything." Graves merely inclined his head, expressionless as ever. Dinner was announced. The dining room was panelled in dark walnut and lit almost entirely by candles. The electricity, Eleanor explained lightly, was inclined to fail when the wind came from the north. A long table had been laid for 9, with silver epergnes of forced hothouse roses and a centrepiece of holly and mistletoe. Miss Marple found herself placed between Colonel Blimp and Rupert Winter, with Vivian Vale opposite and Clarissa at the far end, glowering at nothing in particular. Conversation began with the weather, inevitable, and moved quickly to the impossibility of getting more staff. "It's the welfare state," Colonel Blimp declared, carving the roast beef with military precision. "Servants think they're as good as we are now. No sense of place." "Perhaps they simply prefer wages to gratitude," Clarissa said sweetly. Rupert laughed into his claret. Here, though gratitude does keep one nicely in whisky." Eleanor, at the head of the table, smiled the tight smile of a hostess steering a boat through shoals. The fish course had just been removed when Hargreaves placed a small silver salver at his mistress's elbow. On it lay a single envelope, cheap white paper, the address typed. Eleanor's hand hesitated above it. Every head turned. "Another of your charming billet stew, cousin?" Rupert asked pleasantly. Eleanor slit the envelope with the butter knife. She drew out a single sheet and unfolded it. Even by candlelight, the colour drained from her face. She read aloud, her voice perfectly steady. "The 4th husband will die on Christmas Eve. Tonight the first warning is given." A moment of absolute silence. Then Colonel Blimp slammed his hand on the table, making the glasses jump. "Damned impudence! Hand it over, Eleanor. I'll have the fellow horsewhipped." Vivian Vale gave a delighted little shiver. "How perfectly thrilling! Just like one of my films." Clarissa stubbed out her cigarette in the salt cellar. "Really, stepmamma, you do choose the oddest moments for amateur theatricals." "It is not theatrical," Eleanor said quietly. She passed the note to Miss Marple. The same blunt capitals as the earlier letters. The paper was the commonest sort sold in any post office. No scent, no watermark. Miss Marple turned it over thoughtfully. "Typed on a Remington portable, I should say. The E is slightly out of alignment. Curious." Graves spoke for the first time, his voice low. "The envelope was in the post bag delivered this afternoon, my lady, sealed when it reached the house." "So someone in this room wrote it," Clarissa said. She looked slowly round the table, eyes bright with malice. "Or had it delivered by an accomplice? How deliciously sordid." Rupert lifted his glass to her. "Careful, darling. Motive is a dangerous thing to wave about." The pudding arrived in a blue flame of brandy. Nobody had much appetite left. Coffee was served in the drawing room. The wind had risen to a continuous shriek. Snow hissed against the windows like thrown gravel. Eleanor drew Miss Marple aside near the Christmas tree. "I did not arrange this, Jane. You believe me?" My dear, of course." Miss Marple studied the strained faces across the room. "But someone wishes you to appear either very frightened or very foolish. The question is which, and why?" Colonel Blimp was pouring himself a stiff whisky and talking loudly about taking a shotgun to the blackguard. Vivian Vale had persuaded Graves to turn the wireless to some dance music and was attempting to teach Rupert the rumba. Clarissa had vanished altogether. At 10 o'clock, Eleanor announced that she was exhausted and would retire. The party broke up with unnatural speed. Miss Marple lingered to examine the Christmas tree. Among the glass baubles hung a number of antique wax angels, their wings tipped with gilt. One of them had fallen. Its little wax face was cracked across. As she bent to pick it up, she noticed something tucked behind a branch. A scrap of white paper, identical to the anonymous note. On it, in the same printed capitals, were the words "First chimes at midnight." She slipped it into her evening bag just as Graves appeared at her elbow. "May I show you to your room, Miss Marple?" "Thank you, Mr. Graves. Tell me, does the clock on the stable block still strike the hours?" "It does, very loudly. The whole house hears it." "How interesting," said Miss Marple mildly. Upstairs, the corridor was bitterly cold. Her room looked out over the rear courtyard. Through the whirl of snow, she could just distinguish the dark bulk of the stables. And, atop them, the face of the clock, faintly luminous. She undressed slowly, placed her dressing gown across the chair, and set her small travelling clock to local time. Then she opened her notebook and wrote in neat, tiny handwriting. "Note delivered at dinner. Typed. Second scrap on tree, hand-printed. Different hands. Midnight chimes threatened. Whose room is nearest the stable clock?" She underlined the last line twice, closed the book, and climbed into the vast four-poster bed. The sheets were icy. Somewhere far below, the house settled with creaks and groans like an old ship. At 11:55 the wind dropped for a moment, uncanny in its suddenness. At midnight precisely, the stable clock began to strike. 12 deep, deliberate notes that seemed to shake the very bones of Frostmir Hall. On the 12th stroke a scream rang out, high, raw, and unmistakably human, coming from the west wing. Miss Marple was already out of bed and reaching for her dressing gown. The game, as Colonel Blimp might have said, was afoot. Chapter 4. The Midnight Scream. The scream tore through the house like a shard of ice, sharp enough to cut sleep itself in two. Miss Marple's bare feet were already on the cold floorboards before the last echo died. She slipped her arms into the sleeves of her wool dressing gown, thrust her feet into felt slippers, seized the small torch she always kept on the bedside table, and stepped into the corridor. Every door along the west wing was opening at once. Colonel Blimp appeared first, scarlet-faced, pyjamas stuffed into cavalry twill trousers. An old Webley revolver in his fist. "By God, what the devil!" Next came Clarissa in a peach silk wrapper, hair loose about her shoulders, eyes wide and very bright. Rupert followed, barefoot, shirt half-buttoned, a brandy glass still in one hand, as though he had carried it from the drawing-room. Vivian Vale drifted out like a stage apparition in clouds of pale chiffon, mascara slightly smudged but otherwise perfect. Graves, fully dressed, came running up the servants' stair. "Her ladyship," he snapped. "Still in her room, I think," Miss Marple said quietly. The scream came from this direction. They all looked towards the heavy oak door at the very end of the passage. Colonel Blimp's room. The Colonel himself was already striding forward. "That's my damned room!" He flung the door wide and reached for the light switch. Nothing happened. The electric bulb remained dark. Miss Marple's torch beam cut a narrow path through the gloom. It picked out a high old-fashioned bed with the counterpane turned back, a dressing table, a wardrobe standing open, and then, on the turkey carpet between bed and fireplace, the rigid figure of Colonel Reginald Blimp himself. Only it was not the Colonel who stood breathing fire beside them. The man on the floor wore the Colonel's crimson paisley dressing gown. His face was purple, swollen, eyes starting from their sockets. A thin ribbon of foam had dried at one corner of the mouth. The smell of bitter almonds hung unmistakably in the air. "Prussic acid," Graves said at once, kneeling. He touched the carotid artery, then looked up. "Dead 10 or 15 minutes at most." The living Colonel gave a roar like a wounded bull. "That's my dressing gown. I hung it on the back of the bathroom door not an hour ago." Miss Marple moved the torch beam slowly across the room. The window was closed and latched from the inside. A thin line of snow had drifted onto the sill, showing no disturbance. The door had been neither locked nor bolted. Graves had opened it without resistance. Clarissa gave a small, hysterical laugh. "Well, Colonel, it seems someone mistook your dressing gown for you. How careless of them." Vivian Vale pressed a hand to her throat. "Poisoned! In his own room! But how did the murderer get in and out?" "Exactly," Miss Marple murmured. "And why the dressing gown?" Rupert drained his brandy in one gulp. "Because the poor devil was meant to be the Colonel. Someone wanted him dead and used the gown as identification in the dark. Simple." The Colonel rounded on him, revolver wavering. "Are you suggesting I was the target, sir?" "I'm suggesting," Rupert replied coolly, "that you make a very loud, very obvious target. Always have." Graves stood. "We must fetch her ladyship, and no one is to leave this corridor until we have some order." He strode off towards Eleanor's suite. The rest followed instinctively, clustering like sheep in a storm. Lady Eleanor met them at her door in a black velvet robe, hair in a long silver plait over one shoulder. She took in the scene with a single sweeping glance. "Reginald?" she asked very quietly. "Dead, ma'am," Graves said. "Poison. In his Colonel Blimp's dressing gown." Eleanor closed her eyes for a moment. When she opened them again, they were bright and hard. "Then we are all in danger. Bring everyone to the library at once. Hargreaves will have coffee. We will lock the doors and decide what is to be done." Half an hour later, they sat in the long library beneath the gaze of 200 leather-bound volumes that had not been read since the reign of George V. A fire had been lit. The flames hissed whenever snow found its way down the great chimney. Hargreaves moved silently among them with a silver coffee pot. No one spoke until he had withdrawn, and the double doors were shut. Eleanor broke the silence. "The telephone wires are down. The drive is 4 feet deep already and still snowing. The village constable cannot reach us for 2 days, at the earliest, perhaps 3. We are prisoners here, with a murderer." Colonel Blimp, still clutching his revolver, growled, "I'll keep watch myself. Let the blighter try anything." Clarissa lit another cigarette, with fingers that trembled only slightly. "How very gallant! And who will watch you, Colonel?" "Enough," Eleanor said sharply. "We will pair the rooms. No one sleeps alone tonight. Graves and Rupert will take the west wing. Clarissa and Vivian the east. Miss Marple, you will stay with me." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Very sensible." Vivian Vale gave a theatrical shudder. "And the body? We can't leave poor Colonel Blimp, either of them, lying on the carpet." Graves answered, "I have locked the room and taken the key. Nothing will be touched until the police arrive." Rupert poured himself more coffee and laced it liberally from a decanter. 3 days, you say? 3 days of happy families. How festive!" Miss Marple had been sitting quietly near the fire, her small hands folded in her lap. Now she spoke for the first time since entering the library. "Tell me, Colonel, when you left your dressing gown on the bathroom door, was the bathroom door locked?" "Locked? Good Lord, no. Never lock anything in my own house. Begging your pardon, Eleanor." "And the communicating door between bathroom and bedroom, was that open or closed?" "Open, I suppose. Always is. Thank you." She turned to Graves. "And the poison? Do you keep prussic acid on the estate? For photography, perhaps, or pest control? There is a dark room in the old nursery wing," Graves said slowly. "His late lordship was an enthusiastic amateur. The chemicals are still there, I believe." Eleanor's hand went to her throat. "Geoffrey's dark room. No one has entered it since he died 5 years ago." "Then someone has entered it very recently," Miss Marple said gently. "And someone knew exactly which dressing gown belonged to the Colonel. That is rather interesting, don't you think?" The fire crackled. Outside, the wind flung great handfuls of snow against the tall windows. Clarissa crushed out her cigarette. "So the murderer is one of us? How perfectly cosy!" "Or," Miss Marple added in the same mild tone, "someone who knows this house extremely well and can move about it unseen. We must not jump to conclusions." But her eyes, bright and very alert behind the spectacles, rested for a moment on each face in turn. At 2:00, they separated uneasily into their allotted pairs. Graves and the Colonel carried the dead man, still grotesquely clad in the crimson dressing gown, to an unused bedroom on the ground floor and locked the door. Miss Marple walked with Eleanor along the portrait gallery towards the mistress's suite. Snow light filtered through the high windows, turning the ancestors a ghostly blue. Eleanor paused beneath the portrait of her third husband, Sir Geoffrey, who had died of a heart attack while developing photographs in that same dark room. "Do you believe in curses, Jane?" she whispered. "I believe," Miss Marple replied, "in human wickedness dressed up as fate. And I believe we have a very clever and very desperate person under this roof." She slipped her hand into Eleanor's cold fingers. "Come, my dear, let us lock our door and set a chair beneath the handle, for good measure. Tomorrow we will begin to ask the right questions." Behind them, the great house settled into uneasy silence, listening to its own heartbeats and the endless whisper of the snow. Chapter 5. Footprints that vanish morning came reluctantly, a dull iron light that seeped through the curtains rather than broke. The wind had dropped, leaving a silence so complete that the house seemed to hold its breath. Miss Marple woke first. Eleanor still slept, one hand curled beneath her cheek like a child. Miss Marple rose quietly, dressed in her warmest tweed skirt and cardigan, and slipped downstairs. The hall was empty save for Hargreaves, who moved about extinguishing candles that had burned all night. He gave her a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Any change in the weather, Hargreaves?" "The snow has stopped, miss, but the drifts are 6 feet in places. The stable clock says 7:15, and the thermometer outside the kitchen door reads 14 degrees of frost." Miss Marple thanked him and went to the front door. It opened with a reluctant groan. A wall of snow faced her, packed hard by the wind. She closed the door again and made her way to the side entrance that led to the courtyard. Here the drifts were lower. The courtyard was a perfect white rectangle, unmarked except for one set of footprints that began at the kitchen door, crossed to the woodshed, and returned the same way. The gardener's prints, no doubt. But from the west wing, Colonel Blimp's bedroom window, there was something quite different. A single line of footprints came out of the wall beneath the window, took 4 precise steps into the centre of the courtyard, and then simply ceased. The snow beyond was smooth and virgin, glittering in the pale light. Miss Marple stood looking at them for a long minute, her breath making small clouds. Then she went back inside. By 8:30, everyone was gathered in the morning room, bleary-eyed and short-tempered. Breakfast had been laid on the sideboard. Porridge, kippers, eggs kept warm under silver covers. No one had much appetite. Colonel Blimp, red-eyed and still in his creased uniform trousers, was demanding to be allowed to telephone the chief constable. Graves repeated patiently that the wires were down and would remain so until the snow plough from Wintercombe reached them. Clarissa smoked continuously. Vivian Vale had wrapped herself in a sable coat and kept murmuring too dreadful whenever anyone looked at her. Rupert alone seemed almost cheerful. "Well," he said, buttering toast, "at least the murderer has a sense of the dramatic. Footprints that stop dead in the middle of the yard. Very neat." Miss Marple laid down her teacup. "I wonder if we might all go outside for a moment. There is something I should like everyone to see." They looked at her in surprise, but the novelty of action was irresistible. Within 10 minutes they stood in the courtyard, muffled in coats and scarves, staring at the impossible footprints. The prints were deep and clear, a man's shoe, perhaps a 10 or 11, with a worn patch on the left heel. 4 steps from the wall, then nothing. Colonel Blimp poked at the snow with his stick. "Deuced odd. Fellow must have flown." "Or been carried," Clarissa said, "picked up by accomplices on a rope from the roof, like a commando raid." Vivian Vale gave a little scream. "Don't! I shall have nightmares." Graves knelt, examining the final print. "The edge is clean, no sign of dragging or lifting, and the snow here is undisturbed for 20 yards in every direction." Miss Marple spoke quietly. "Notice the direction. The prints come out from the wall, not towards it. That suggests the murderer left the room after the crime, not entered it." Rupert gave a low whistle. "But the window was latched on the inside. We all saw that." "Precisely," Miss Marple said. She turned to Hargreaves, who had followed them out. "When was this courtyard last swept clear?" "Yesterday morning, miss, before the snow began again at noon." "So these prints were made some time between noon yesterday and 7 o'clock this morning. Thank you." They went back inside, brushing snow from their coats. In the hall, Miss Marple paused beneath the great staircase. "One more thing. Colonel, may I borrow your bedroom slippers for a moment?" The Colonel looked baffled, but handed them over. They were large, sheepskin-lined, with hard leather soles. Miss Marple held one sole upwards. There, clearly visible, was a worn patch on the left heel, exactly matching the prints in the snow. Everyone stared. "Good Lord," the Colonel muttered. "Those are my slippers. I noticed last night one was missing from my dressing room. Thought I'd kicked it under the bed." Miss Marple handed them back. "So," she said gently, "the murderer wore the Colonel's own slippers to make the prints, walked 4 steps, and then, what? Removed them while standing in the snow. That would leave other marks. Stepped backwards in the same prints? Possible, but difficult in deep snow. Or," she looked up at the gallery that ran round the first floor, "or the prints were made from above." Rupert followed her gaze. "You mean someone lowered a pair of boots on a string from the window, pressed them into the snow 4 times, and hauled them up again?" "It has been done before," Miss Marple said. "In the case of the abominable snowman in the Himalayas, for instance, though I believe that was a hoax. Still, the principle is sound." Clarissa laughed, a hard, brittle sound. Really, Miss Marple, you are too priceless. Next, you'll be telling us the murderer is a ghost." "I have never believed in ghosts," Miss Marple replied tranquilly. "Only in people who wish to create the illusion of one." Eleanor, who had been silent until now, spoke for the first time. "Then the murderer is still trying to frighten me. First the letters, now this charade in the snow. Or, Miss Marple said, trying to confuse us, to make us believe the impossible, so that we overlook the possible." Coffee was served in the library. The atmosphere had changed. Suspicion hung in the air like smoke. Miss Marple took her cup and settled into a corner by the fire. She opened her notebook and wrote, "Slippers confirm prints deliberately faked. Murderer has access to Colonel's dressing room. Knows house intimately, darkroom courtyard, window latches. Wanted us to see the footprints. Why?" She looked up. Graves was watching her with that blank, unreadable face. "Mr. Graves," she said suddenly, "you were the Colonel's Batman during the war. Were you not?" He inclined his head. "In 45, briefly, before I entered her ladyship's service." "And you still keep army hours, I imagine? Up at 6? 5:30 usually. Did you happen to look out at the courtyard this morning before the rest of us?" A pause, so slight that only Miss Marple noticed. "I did glance out of the west window at about 6:15. The prints were already there." "Thank you," Miss Marple said, and closed her notebook. Outside, the sun came out for the first time in days, striking long golden shafts across the snow. The footprints glittered like a pathway to nowhere. Inside Frostmir Hall, 9 living souls moved warily about their business, each watching the others, each wondering who had walked 4 steps into the snow and then vanished into thin air. And somewhere in the great house, a clock ticked on, counting down the hours to Christmas Eve. Chapter 6. Secrets in the Widow's Boudoir. The afternoon lay heavy on Frostmir Hall, a white hush broken only by the occasional thud of snow sliding from the eaves. After luncheon, a silent meal of cold beef and pickled beetroot, Eleanor drew Miss Marple upstairs. "Come to my sitting room, Jane. I need to show you something, and I would rather not do it in front of the others." The boudoir was a room Miss Marple had not yet seen. Pale green walls, a fire of apple wood, long windows veiled by nets of Brussels lace. On a small escritoire lay a Morocco leather diary, bound with a tiny gold lock now snapped open. Eleanor closed the door and turned the key. "Geoffrey's diary," she said. "My 3rd husband, the one who died in the darkroom. I kept meaning to burn it, but somehow I never could." She handed it to Miss Marple. The entries were brief, precise, the handwriting of a man who had spent his life giving orders. 15th of March, 1947. E. Hysterical again about money. Told her the insurance on Richard will clear the death duties. She does not understand that one cannot spend capital twice. To April, 1947. Clarissa caught trying to open my safe. Little cat has claws. 20 was June, 1947. Rupert drunk at dinner, threatened to tell everything if I do not advance him $5,000. He forgets I hold the mortgage on his flat in Albany. Miss Marple turned the pages carefully. 10th of September 1947, prussic acid arrived from the photographic suppliers. Strong solution, must keep locked away. E asked what it was for. Told her developing. She looked odd. The final entry, dated the day before Sir Geoffrey's death. 24th of November 1947. Heart playing up again. Must see Harley Street when we return to town. E insists on developing the plates herself tonight. Says she wants to surprise me. Women and surprises. Dangerous combination. Miss Marple closed the diary. "Your husband believed you were trying to poison him." Eleanor laughed, a brittle sound. Geoffrey believed everyone was trying to poison him. He took enough digitalis to fell an ox, and still thought I was slipping things into his brandy. But read the last page, Jane. Tipped in at the back was a single sheet in a different hand. Eleanor's own looping script. "If anything happens to me, look in the darkroom developing tray. I have left proof. It was pinned to his will," Eleanor said quietly. "He died before he could tell anyone what the proof was. The police found nothing in the tray except ordinary hypo." Miss Marple tapped the diary against her palm. 3 husbands, 3 large insurance policies, 3 convenient deaths, and now anonymous letters threatening a 4th husband who does not exist. Someone is trying very hard to make the world believe you are a murderess, Eleanor. "Or to drive me out of my mind," Eleanor whispered. "Some days I almost think I am." A soft knock sounded at the door. "Lady Winter!" It was Graves's voice. "Miss Clarissa insists on speaking with you. She's rather upset." Eleanor unlocked the door. Clarissa swept in, cheeks flushed, eyes glittering with tears or fury. Miss Marple could not decide which. "Stepmamma, I have just found this pushed under my door." She held out a folded sheet of cheap paper. The same printed capitals. "Ask your father's widow what really happened to him in Egypt." Clarissa's voice shook. "My father died of a snakebite on a dig near Luxor. Everyone knows that. Why torment me with it now?" Eleanor took the note with steady fingers. "Because someone wishes to see us all at one another's throats," she said. "Thank you, Clarissa. Leave this with me." When the girl had gone, Eleanor looked at Miss Marple. "Richard, my 2nd husband, was bitten by a horned viper. The camp was remote. Antivenin did not arrive in time. There was an inquest. Accidental death." But rumours persisted. Of course. A beautiful English woman alone in the desert with a much older husband who left her everything. People will talk. Miss Marple returned to the diary. 3 accidents, 3 fortunes, and now a house full of people who might profit if you were removed. Clarissa inherits if you die without a new will. Rupert believes he has a moral claim on the estate. Colonel Blimp nurses an ancient grudge. Vivian Vale. Well, actresses are often short of money. Even Graves. Graves has been with me 7 years, Eleanor said quickly. He is the only one I trust. Miss Marple said nothing, but her mild blue eyes rested thoughtfully on her friend. Downstairs the gong sounded for tea. They descended to find the drawing room transformed into a stage set for a particularly uncomfortable play. Vivian Vale reclined on the sofa, reading a script aloud in a dramatic whisper. Rupert was mixing cocktails with unnecessary violence. Colonel Blimp stood at the window staring out at the frozen garden as though expecting an attack. Graves moved among them with a tray of sandwiches no one wanted. Clarissa sat apart, twisting a handkerchief into knots. When Eleanor and Miss Marple entered, all conversation stopped for a fraction too long. "Tea, everyone," Eleanor said brightly, "and then perhaps we might have some music. It is, after all, nearly Christmas." Vivian closed her script with a snap. "Music, my dear. The only thing I can think of is that ghastly stable clock chiming the hours until the next murder." Colonel Blimp turned from the window. "Speaking of clocks, ma'am, I've been thinking. That poor devil last night. Wrong dressing gown, wrong man entirely. Someone's playing merry hell with us." Rupert handed Miss Marple a cup. "Or someone has very poor eyesight. Though I can't imagine who would mistake a house guest for the master of the house." His eyes flicked briefly to Graves. Miss Marple sipped her tea. "Tell me, Mr. Rupert, did you ever visit the darkroom when Sir Geoffrey was alive?" Rupert's smile did not waver. "Good Lord, no! All that messing about with chemicals gave me the creeps. Why?" "No reason," Miss Marple said pleasantly. Outside, the short winter day was already fading. The snow took on a bluish tinge. Long shadows stretched across the lawns like fingers. After tea, Eleanor announced that she was lying down with a headache. Miss Marple excused herself and went instead to the old nursery wing. The darkroom door was locked, but the key hung on a nail just outside. Old-fashioned trust. Inside, the air still smelled faintly of fixer and decay. Dust lay thick on the benches. Developing trays stood in a row, like small white coffins. Miss Marple opened the cupboard beneath the sink. Bottles of chemicals, some half empty, labels peeling. One brown glass bottle marked potassium cyanide. Danger in faded red letters. The wax seal around the stopper had been broken quite recently. A few grains of the white crystals had spilled onto the shelf. She closed the cupboard softly and stood thinking. On her way back, she met Graves in the corridor. "Looking for something, Miss Marple?" "Only memories," she replied. "This used to be the nursery when Eleanor and I were girls. We had a rocking horse named Thunderbolt." Graves's expression did not change. "Her ladyship is asking for you." In the boudoir, Eleanor was standing at the window, a fresh anonymous note in her hand. This one was different, written in ordinary ink, hurried writing. "You have until midnight tomorrow to leave Frostmir forever. Otherwise, the fourth husband dies, and then you." Eleanor's face was paper white. "There is no fourth husband," she said, unless the murderer means to force me to marry someone, anyone, so that the prophecy can be fulfilled." Miss Marple took the note and studied it carefully. "My dear, I think we are dealing with someone who is growing desperate, and desperate people make mistakes." She placed the note beside the others on the table. "Tomorrow is the 22nd. Christmas Eve is 2 days away. We have very little time." From the stable yard, the clock struck 5. Each note falling clear and cold into the darkening air. Somewhere in the great house, a door closed softly, as though someone had been listening. Chapter 7. The Seance in the Storm Snow. Began again at dusk, not the soft, drifting flakes of earlier days, but hard, dry pellets hurled sideways by a wind that screamed around the eaves like a living creature. The electricity failed at 6:30 with a despairing flicker, plunging Frostmir Hall into candle-lit darkness. In the drawing-room, the fire had been built up to a blaze, yet the cold still crept in. Hargreaves and the footman carried in branching silver candelabra. Shadows leapt across the ceiling like black flames. Vivian Vale, wrapped in a cloak of silver fox, stood dramatically in the centre of the rug. "Since we are trapped here with a murderer," she announced, "we may as well ask the spirits who it is. I have held seances in half the great houses of England. Tonight we shall have the truth." Colonel Blimp snorted. "Poppycock and trickery." Clarissa's eyes glittered. "I think it's a splendid idea. Anything is better than sitting here waiting for the next corpse." Rupert was already pushing the heavy furniture to the walls. "Come along, Colonel. Even the Bengal Lancers believed in ghosts once upon a time." Eleanor looked at Miss Marple, a plea in her eyes. Miss Marple inclined her head very slightly. "If it will calm everyone's nerves, my dear, why not?" Within 10 minutes, a round table had been placed in the middle of the room, 7 chairs set about it. Candles were extinguished until only one tall taper remained burning in the centre. The curtains were drawn tight against the howling night. Vivian took command. "We must hold hands. No one is to break the circle. Colonel, you on my left, Clarissa on my right, Lady Winter opposite me, Miss Marple, you beside her. Rupert and Mr. Graves will complete the ring." Graves hesitated. "I would prefer to remain outside the circle, madam, in case assistance is required." Vivian gave him a dazzling smile. "Nonsense, Mr. Graves. Even secretaries have souls." They took their places. The single candle threw enormous shadows on the walls. Vivian closed her eyes, tilted her head back, and began in a low, throbbing voice. "Spirits of those who have passed beyond the veil, we call to you on this night of storm and sorrow. 3 husbands have been taken from this house. 1 guest lies newly dead. Speak to us. Name the hand that struck them down." The wind shrieked. The candle flame bowed and straightened. A silence so complete that Miss Marple could hear the ticking of her own wristwatch. Then a soft tapping began beneath the table. 3 measured knocks. Vivian's voice rose. "Is someone there? Knock once for yes." "Knock!" Clarissa gave a nervous giggle, quickly stifled. "Who are you?" Vivian demanded. "Spell your name." The knocks came rapidly now, 26 in careful sequence. Vivian counted them aloud, translating into letters. R-I-C-H-A-R-D. She opened her eyes wide. "Richard! Lady Winter's second husband!" Eleanor's fingers tightened convulsively on Miss Marple's. A low moan seemed to issue from Vivian's throat. When she spoke again, her voice was deeper, rougher, an uncanny imitation of a man's. "Eleanor, why did you let me die in the desert?" Eleanor half rose. "Richard, I tried. There was no serum. Poison," the voice growled. "You wanted the money." Colonel Blimp started to his feet. "This is disgusting." Vivian's hand shot out and forced him down again. "Do not break the circle." The candle suddenly guttered as though blown by an unseen breath. In the same instant, the French window behind Eleanor burst open with a crash. Snow swept in like smoke. The candle went out. Darkness, absolute and immediate. A woman screamed. There was the sound of a chair overturning, a muffled grunt, the sharp crack of something hard striking flesh. Then Graves's voice, calm and deadly. "Hold still, everyone! No one move!" A match flared. Graves stood by the door, one hand on the light switch. He had evidently found the fuse box. The electric chandelier blazed on. Rupert was half-sprawled across the table, clutching his left arm. Blood seeped between his fingers and dripped onto the green baize cloth. At his feet lay an antique ice pick, the kind once used for breaking sugar loaves, its steel point dark and wet. Vivian Vale stared at it in genuine horror. "Where did that come from?" Colonel Blimp was on his knees beside Rupert. "Nasty but not fatal. Went through the muscle. Graves, brandy and bandages." Eleanor stood white and shaking, both hands pressed to her mouth. Miss Marple alone remained seated, her small figure upright in the midst of chaos. She looked slowly round the circle. "Notice," she said quietly, "that the ice pick was aimed at the place where Eleanor had been sitting. When the candle went out, she had risen slightly. Rupert leaned forward at the wrong moment and took the blow meant for her. Graves was already binding Rupert's arm with a napkin. Rupert managed a crooked smile. Saved by psychical research. There's a first." Clarissa's voice cut across the room, high and frightened. "But who threw it? We were all holding hands." Miss Marple picked up the ice pick carefully by the wooden handle and examined it. A short weapon, easily concealed in a wide sleeve or a fur cuff. The throw was from the left side of the table, someone sitting between Vivian and Eleanor. That placed the thrower as either Colonel Blimp or Graves. The Colonel's face purpled. "Damned if I'll be accused. No one is accusing anyone yet," Miss Marple said mildly. "But someone took advantage of the darkness created by the opening window. And someone opened that window beforehand, probably loosening the catch earlier in the day." She turned to Vivian. "My dear, your performance was most convincing. Perhaps a little too convincing." Vivian's beautiful eyes widened. "Are you suggesting I staged everything?" "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said, "that the spirits were remarkably well informed about the exact moment to blow out the candle." Hargreaves appeared in the doorway with a medical box. Behind him, the footman carried fresh candles. The electricity had failed again almost immediately. While Rupert's arm was properly bandaged, Miss Marple drew Graves aside. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, when the lights came on just now, where was your left hand?" Graves met her gaze steadily. "On Miss Clarissa's wrist, as instructed." "And yet," Miss Marple said, "I distinctly felt a third hand brush my own just before the window opened. A cold hand in a wool glove. Curious." Graves said nothing. Upstairs, Rupert was put to bed with a sedative and a hot water bottle. The others gathered in the library, subdued and thoroughly frightened. Eleanor poured brandy with a shaking hand. "First the Colonel's double, now Rupert. Someone is working through the house like the angel of death." Miss Marple stood by the fire, warming her small hands. "Or," she said, "someone wishes us to believe that the danger is random when it is anything but. 2 attacks on men, 1 near fatal, 1 fatal, yet both intended, I believe, for Eleanor." She looked round the strained faces. "Tomorrow is the 23rd of December. Christmas Eve is the day after. We have 36 hours to prevent a third and final attempt." Outside, the storm reached a new pitch. The old house groaned and shuddered as though trying to tear itself from its foundations. In the silence that followed, the stable clock struck 10. 10 cold, deliberate strokes that seemed to mock them all. And somewhere in the darkness of Frostmir Hall, the murderer smiled, sharpened another weapon, and waited for the next candle to go out. Chapter 8. The Widow's Fourth Proposal. The morning of 23rd of December broke clear and mercilessly cold. The storm had spent itself in the night, leaving a sky the colour of polished steel, and drifts piled against the ground-floor windows like frozen waves. Frostmir Hall glittered in the hard light, every pane laced with ferns of ice. Miss Marple rose early, as was her habit, and found the house already stirring. Hargreaves informed her that Mr. Rupert's arm was swollen but not infected, and that Lady Winter had asked that everyone assemble in the morning room at 11 o'clock for an announcement. Miss Marple buttered a thin slice of toast, drank 1 cup of tea, and then went quietly to the library. She spent a profitable hour among the estate ledgers Graves had left carelessly open on the desk. What she read there caused her eyebrows to rise a fraction higher than usual. At 5 minutes to 11, she entered the morning room. The others were already present, arranged like players in a tableau. Eleanor standing by the window, back straight, chin high. Graves a pace behind her left shoulder, hands clasped behind his back. Clarissa pale and furious on the sofa. Colonel Blimp pacing like a caged bear. Vivian Vale draped in violet velvet and apparently hungover. Rupert reclining in an armchair with his bandaged arm in a sling, and a large whisky already in his good hand. Eleanor did not waste time. "Thank you for coming. I have decided to end the terror that hangs over this house in the only way left to me." She turned to Graves and held out her hand. He took it instantly. Mr. Graves has done me the honour of consenting to become my husband. We will be married by special licence on Christmas Eve. The banns are not required in Scotland, and the estate has a private chapel. The ceremony will take place at 11 o'clock at night, exactly 1 hour before the threatened time. A stunned silence. Clarissa was the first to recover. She sprang up, cheeks scarlet. "You cannot be serious! Marry your secretary! It is grotesque!" Colonel Blimp cleared his throat explosively. "Steady on, Eleanor. Man's a good sort, but, well, socially." Vivian Vale gave a low, theatrical laugh. "My dear, you are braver than any heroine I ever played. To walk straight into the prophecy." Rupert raised his glass. "Congratulations, old man. You always did land on your feet." Only Miss Marple remained perfectly still, her mild blue eyes travelling from Eleanor's defiant face to Graves's expressionless one and back again. Eleanor lifted her chin higher. "The letters insist that a fourth husband will die on Christmas Eve. Very well. Let there be a fourth husband. Let the murderer strike if he dares, in a lighted chapel, with every one of us present. I refuse to cower any longer." Graves spoke for the first time, his voice calm. "I have already telephoned the bishop's secretary from the village yesterday, when I walked down to fetch the doctor for Mr. Rupert. The special licence will arrive by the afternoon post if the roads are cleared as far as Wintercombe. The chaplain from the regiment has agreed to officiate." Clarissa gave a strangled cry. "You planned this, both of you!" Eleanor met her stepdaughter's gaze steadily. "I decided it last night, after the attack on Rupert. Graves offered immediately. It is the only way to force the murderer's hand." Miss Marple set down her cup. "And if the murderer's hand is forced," she asked softly, "what then? A wedding is a public event. A murder in a chapel would be difficult to arrange." Graves allowed himself the ghost of a smile. "Exactly, Miss Marple. Everyone will be in the chapel. Everyone will be watching everyone else. The murderer will have no opportunity." Colonel Blimp muttered something about setting a trap with human bait, but subsided when Eleanor looked at him. The meeting broke up in confusion. Clarissa stormed out first, followed by the Colonel. Vivian drifted away, humming the wedding march with malicious sweetness. Rupert remained to finish his whisky. When only Miss Marple, Eleanor and Graves were left, Eleanor closed the door. "Well, Jane, you have said nothing." Miss Marple regarded them both for a long moment. "My dear Eleanor, you have always been impulsive. But this is reckless beyond anything." "It is the only way," Eleanor repeated stubbornly. Graves inclined his head. "With respect, Miss Marple, her ladyship's life is already in danger. This merely concentrates the danger into one place and 1 hour." Miss Marple turned to him. "Tell me, Mr. Graves, when did you first propose marriage?" A flicker, almost imperceptible, crossed the secretary's face. "Last night, after the seance. Yet you walked to the village yesterday morning and telephoned the bishop's secretary before the seance took place. Curious timing." Graves did not flinch. "I anticipated that her ladyship might accept." Eleanor looked from one to the other, suddenly uncertain. "Jane, what are you saying?" "I am saying," Miss Marple replied gently, "that someone in this house has gone to great trouble to convince the world that you are a husband-killer. 3 convenient deaths, 3 large insurances, and now a 4th husband who appears like a rabbit from a hat exactly when the prophecy demands him. It is all remarkably convenient for someone." Eleanor's hand went to her throat. "You think, Graves—" "I think," Miss Marple interrupted, "that we are watching a very clever performance, and I am no longer sure who wrote the script." Graves met her gaze steadily. "You wrong me, ma'am. I love her ladyship. I always have." Miss Marple inclined her head. "Love is a word that covers many motives, Mr. Graves." She left them standing together in the cold sunlight and went upstairs to her room. There she sat at the little writing desk and added several lines to her notebook in her neat, tiny handwriting. "Marriage announced 23 Thursday Sirs special license, already applied for on 22nd. Insurance on Eleanor's life, taken out by Graves in 1951, 75,000 tons, double indemnity for accidental death. Beneficiary, Lionel Graves." She underlined the last line 3 times. Downstairs, preparations for a wedding began with grim efficiency. Hargreaves was sent to air the private chapel and polish the brass. The cook wept into the Christmas puddings. Clarissa locked herself in her room and refused to come out. In the library, Miss Marple found Colonel Blimp cleaning his service revolver with unnecessary thoroughness. "Mark my words," he growled, "this wedding will be the death of someone, and I don't mean in the poetic sense." Miss Marple sat down opposite him. "Colonel, you were engaged to Eleanor once, I understand. Long time ago, before the First War. She threw me over for a richer man. Always did have an eye to the main chance, Eleanor. And yet you came when she invited you." The Colonel snapped the revolver shut. "Curiosity, I suppose. Wanted to see what the Winter Widow looked like after all these years. Didn't expect to be mistaken for a corpse myself." Miss Marple folded her hands. "Tell me, Colonel, do you believe Eleanor murdered her husbands?" He hesitated. "Between ourselves, I've never been sure. Too many coincidences. But if she did, she's a damned cool hand. And if she didn't, well, someone's gone to a deal of trouble to make it look that way." "Exactly," Miss Marple said softly. "Someone." Outside, the sun began its slow descent. The temperature dropped further. The snow crackled underfoot like broken glass. At 5 o'clock, the special license arrived by motorcycle courier from Wintercombe, half frozen but triumphant. Graves received it at the door with a slight bow, as though it were the most natural thing in the world. That evening, the house dressed for a wedding that might also be a funeral. Candles were lit early. Fires blazed in every grate. The chapel was swept and garlanded with holly. The scent of pine and beeswax drifted through the corridors. Dinner was a silent affair. Clarissa did not appear. Vivian Vale wore black velvet and diamonds, as if for a premiere. Rupert managed to drink a toast with his good arm. Colonel Blimp loaded his revolver and placed it beside his plate. At 10 o'clock, Eleanor came down in a gown of silver lamé, the winter diamonds blazing at her throat. She looked magnificent and quite desperate. Graves, in perfect evening dress, offered his arm. Miss Marple watched them descend the great staircase together and felt, with the certainty of long experience, that the final act was about to begin. The stable clock struck the quarter. Somewhere in the house a door closed very softly. Christmas Eve was only 60 minutes away. Chapter 9. The Christmas Eve Revelation. The private chapel of Frostmir Hall lay at the end of the east wing, a small Gothic jewel built by an ancestor who had taken the Crusades rather too seriously. Candles in iron sconces threw pools of gold across the stone floor. Banks of holly and white roses masked the chill of the walls. At the altar stood the elderly regimental chaplain in surplice and medals, prayer book trembling slightly in gloved hands. It was 5 minutes to 11 on Christmas Eve. The little congregation sat rigid in the carved pews. Colonel Blimp with his revolver across his knees. Clarissa white-faced in black velvet. Vivian Vale clutching a lace handkerchief as though it were a prop. Rupert pale but steady, one arm still in its sling. Hargreaves and the 2 indoor maids stood at the back, assured into silence. Miss Marple sat in the front pew beside Eleanor, who wore the winter diamonds and a wedding gown of heavy ivory satin that had belonged to her grandmother. Graves waited at the altar steps, immaculate, expressionless. The stable clock began to strike 11. Each deep note reverberated through the chapel like a funeral bell. At the 12th stroke, Eleanor rose. Graves turned to face her. The chaplain cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," Miss Marple stood up. "I am so sorry," she said in her soft, precise voice, "but there will be no wedding tonight." Every head turned. Eleanor stared at her, stunned. "Jane?" Miss Marple walked slowly to the centre of the aisle. "The 4th husband cannot die on Christmas Eve," she continued, "because the 4th husband has been dead these 5 years." A collective gasp. Graves took one involuntary step forward. Miss Marple looked at him steadily. "Sir Geoffrey Winter never died in that dark room, did he, Mr. Graves? He simply disappeared. A new identity, a quiet life abroad, and a secretary who returned to manage the estate, and the widow for him." Graves's face remained a mask, but the pulse beating at his temple betrayed him. Colonel Blimp half rose. "What the devil?" "Please," Miss Marple said, raising one small hand. "Let me finish. It will be quicker and kinder if I tell it all." She turned to Eleanor. "My dear, when I read Geoffrey's diary yesterday, I noticed something odd. The final entry spoke of his heart playing up again. Yet the post-mortem found no trace of heart disease, only cyanide. Curious. Then I remembered the insurance policies. 3 large policies on 3 husbands, all payable to you. But the policies on Geoffrey's life were taken out jointly. By you and his secretary, Mr. Lionel Graves. And the beneficiary, if both of you died, was a trust in Switzerland." Eleanor swayed. Clarissa caught her arm. Miss Marple went on, relentless in her gentleness. 5 years ago, Sir Geoffrey decided to vanish. A staged death, a convenient corpse from the morgue. There were air raids, records were chaotic. A secretary who identified the body and signed the papers. Sir Geoffrey became Mr. Grey in Lugano, living quietly on the insurance money that was paid to the Swiss Trust. Mr. Graves remained here to watch over the estate, and over you, Eleanor, because you were the one person who could still destroy the deception if you ever remarried, and a new husband asked awkward questions about the past. Graves spoke at last, his voice perfectly level. "An interesting theory, Miss Marple. But Sir Geoffrey is dead. I saw the body myself." "You saw a body," Miss Marple corrected. "A body with the face damaged by acid, wearing Sir Geoffrey's clothes and ring. You and he planned it together. But something went wrong, didn't it? Geoffrey began to enjoy his freedom too much. He wanted more money. He threatened to return. So you decided the Winter Widow legend must be maintained, at any cost." She reached into her handbag and drew out the brown glass bottle from the darkroom. "Potassium cyanide, almost empty now. You used it first on the unfortunate tramp whose body became Sir Geoffrey's. Then, when the Colonel arrived wearing a dressing gown identical to the one you remembered Sir Geoffrey owning, you saw a chance to begin a new reign of terror. A dead guest would keep everyone imprisoned here, while you completed the real murder. Eleanor herself, on the night she was to marry her secretary. A perfect irony, the 4th husband killing the wife who had helped him disappear." Eleanor made a small strangled sound. Graves's hand moved inside his coat. Colonel Blimp's revolver came up like lightning. "Don't even think it, sir." Graves looked round the chapel, at the ring of hostile faces at the Colonel's steady barrel, and let his hand fall. Miss Marple continued quietly. The footprints that vanished, the ice pick in the dark, the anonymous letters, all designed to build hysteria, to make Eleanor's death seem the logical climax of a curse. And tonight, when she stood at the altar, a quick injection disguised as a loving kiss, or a poisoned ring pressed to her lips. Easy enough for a man who had once been an army pharmacist's mate. She turned to Graves with something almost like compassion. "You were very clever, Mr. Graves. But you forgot one thing. Village life teaches one to notice patterns. 3 husbands dead, 1 secretary always present, 1 estate sliding deeper into debt, while Swiss bank accounts grew fat. And then the final mistake. You applied for the special license before you proposed. A secretary does not act without instructions. You still take orders from your master." Graves smiled then, a thin, bitter smile. "Bravo, Miss Marple. Geoffrey always said you saw too much at school. He will be disappointed to have been proved right." Eleanor stepped forward, the diamonds flashing like ice. "Geoffrey is alive?" "Alive and waiting in Lugano," Graves said. "He sent me a telegram yesterday, delivered by the same motorcyclist who brought the license. He grows impatient for the last act." He reached into his pocket. Not for a weapon this time, but for a folded paper. He held it out to Eleanor. "Your husband's love, madam. He congratulates you on your coming marriage." Eleanor took the telegram with fingers that did not tremble now. She read it once, then let it fall to the flagstones. "Take him away," she said to Colonel Blimp, her voice steady as iron. "The police will be here by morning. They can have both my husbands, the living and the dead." Graves walked down the aisle between the pews, erect, unhurried. At the door, he paused and looked back once, at Miss Marple. "You have ruined a perfect crime, madam." "No," Miss Marple replied gently. "You ruined it yourselves. Greed always does." The chapel doors closed behind him. The candles flickered as though exhaling. Eleanor sank into the front pew, the wedding gown pooling around her like a shroud. Clarissa put an arm round her stepmother, hesitant at first, then fierce. Miss Marple stood alone in the aisle, small and indomitable. Outside, the stable clock began to strike midnight, 12 solemn notes for Christmas Day. No one moved until the last echo died. Then Colonel Blimp cleared his throat. "Well, damn it," he said gruffly. "Merry Christmas, everyone." And astonishingly, someone laughed. Clarissa, a real laugh this time, shaky but true. The curse was broken. Chapter 10. Epilogue. Tea by the fire. Christmas morning arrived like a quiet apology after a quarrel. The sky was the colour of mother of pearl, the snow no longer menacing but soft and bridal, muffling every sound. At 10 o'clock the first police car from Wintercombe crunched up the newly cleared drive, followed by 2 black Wolsleys and an ambulance. By noon, Frostmir Hall was full of measured footsteps, low voices, and the click of cameras. Lionel Graves, once secretary, once husband in all but name, was taken away without resistance. A search of his room yielded the Remington portable typewriter, the leftover potassium cyanide, and a locked dispatch case containing Swiss bank books and a passport in the name of Geoffrey Lionel Winter. Photograph unmistakably that of the dead baronet, 10 years younger and sun-tanned. Sir Geoffrey himself was arrested in Lugano 2 days later. He sent Eleanor a single bunch of Edelweiss and a note that read, "You always did choose your friends wisely, my dear." The inquest, when it came in the new year, was brief. Death by cyanide, person or persons unknown. for the tramp in the darkroom. Murder by cyanide for the unfortunate man who had worn the crimson dressing gown. Attempted murder on 3 further counts. The newspapers feasted for a week and then moved on to a royal tour. But that was later. On Christmas afternoon, the house belonged again to its own people. The great tree still blazed in the drawing-room. The fires were heaped high. Hargreaves, with the stoicism of 25 years' service, produced a Christmas dinner of turkey, sausage, roast potatoes, and 2 flaming puddings as though murders were a minor inconvenience like a late train. They ate in the morning room because the dining room still smelled faintly of police cigarette smoke. Eleanor sat at the head of the table in a soft grey dress, the winter diamonds put away. Clarissa, astonishingly, was on her right, pouring gravy with a hand that no longer shook. Colonel Blimp carved with military precision and told stories of Punjab Christmases no one had ever heard before. Vivian Vale, who had decided to stay on for the drama, drank champagne and declared that the whole affair would make a splendid film. I shall play myself, of course. Rupert, arm in a proper sling, raised a glass again and again to absent husbands. Miss Marple, in her usual corner, ate sparingly and watched them all with quiet affection. After the loyal toast, Eleanor stood. I have something to say. Her voice was steady now, the brittle edge gone. This house has been under a darkness for 5 years. Today the darkness is lifted, and I have Miss Jane Marple to thank for it. She raised her glass to the little old lady in lavender wool. To Jane, who sees everything and forgives most things. They drank. Colonel Blimp's eyes were suspiciously bright. Later, when the others had drifted away to sleep off pudding and relief, Eleanor and Miss Marple sat alone by the drawing-room fire. Snow slid gently from the eaves outside. The candles on the tree had burned low. Eleanor poured tea from the George III pot that had survived 3 husbands and 1 fraud. Do you remember, she said softly, the Christmas dance at Miss Pritchard's Academy in 1908? You wore a white tarlatan dress with forget-me-nots and refused to dance with anyone but the French mistress because the boys were clumsy. Miss Marple's eyes twinkled. And you danced every waltz with the mathematics master and broke 3 hearts before supper. They both laughed, the sound light and young in the quiet room. Eleanor set down her cup. What will you do with Clarissa? She's heiress now, properly. The courts will break the Swiss trust. I shall keep her with me, Eleanor said. She is the closest thing to a daughter I shall ever have. And I find, rather to my surprise, that I like her when she is not trying to hate me. Miss Marple nodded. Anger is often love turned inside out. Outside, the stable clock struck 4. Its notes sounded different now, less like a warning, more like an old friend clearing his throat. Eleanor leaned forward. Jane, why did you come? Really? You could have sent the police. You are not young. The journey was dreadful. Miss Marple considered the leaping flames. Because you asked me, she said simply, and because, my dear, I have learned that when an old school friend writes, I am in danger, one does not weigh inconvenience. One packs the little green valise and comes. Eleanor's eyes filled, but she did not let the tears fall. I thought I had lost the right to friends long ago. Nonsense, Miss Marple said briskly. Friendship is not a balance sheet. Besides, you still owe me 6pence from the tuck shop in 1909. I have waited 43 years. I am patient, but I do have my limits. Eleanor laughed through the unshed tears and reached for the bell. Hargreaves shall find 6pence this instant. But when the butler appeared, Miss Marple waved him away. "Another time. Tonight I am rich enough." They sat in silence then, two elderly ladies watching the fire die into comfortable embers, while outside the snow fell and fell, covering the footprints, the blood, the terror, and the lies with a blanket of perfect white forgiveness. At 11 o'clock Miss Marple rose. "I must write to my nephew. He will be anxious." Eleanor accompanied her to the foot of the great staircase. "Will you come again, Jane? When the daffodils are out, perhaps. Frostmir is rather beautiful in spring." Miss Marple paused on the first step and looked back, her mild blue eyes very bright. "My dear, I shall come whenever you ask. After all, one never knows when another murderer may arrive with the crocuses." She climbed the stairs slowly, the little green valise in her hand looking suddenly light, as though the weight of the week had been lifted from it. Behind her, Eleanor stood in the glow of the dying fire and, for the first time in 5 years, smiled without fear. High above, the mistletoe and holly hung motionless. The house slept the deep healing sleep of a place that has looked evil in the face and seen it routed by a little old lady in wool and lavender. Outside, the snow continued to fall, soft as mercy, silent as grace. Christmas had come to Frostmir Hall at last.